Spatial interpolation. Interpolation is based on Tobler's first law of geography, that near things are more similar than distant things. And that holds true for almost all spatial variables, anything that you measure in space, particularly continuous variables, such as temperature, barometric pressure, elevation, etc. These spatial variables or fields that vary continuously and smoothly and exhibit spatial autocorrelation, which is the formal way in which we express Tobler's first law. And we've already used spatial interpolation when we looked at bilinear and nearest neighbor resampling. These are two types of interpolation to estimate a value at a location that has no value measured. In order to do that, we need to have interpolation. So here's an example, and we'll be using this data. This is an Overbrook neighborhood on the east side of the Rideau River, almost across from Sandy Hill. Parts of it are across from Sandy Hill. And here we have some values, and you can't see the numbers right now, but they're points, and beside the points are the numbers. And these are sampled locations for these numbers. These numbers here are an index of aesthetics. So basically, how nice each, how nice the block faces look at each of these locations. And so it's a quantitative index, and it's measured on a ratio level, in that it goes from 0 to up to 5, which is the maximum number possible for this index. And so we can see the numbers here and numbers associated with points, but what if I want to know the value here, or estimate a value here, or here, or here, or over here, or over here? Well, I don't have samples there, so I have to use interpolation. And via the interpolation methods, I can create a map that looks like what you see on the right here, that shows the continuous estimate across space of the values. And so in this case, blue values are low and red values here are high. And everything in between is a shade of blue, yellow, or orange. And so going from that sample space to a continuous representation here on the right is a spatial interpolation. Now you'll also notice that on the right-hand side, there's an area down here that also has estimates. This is extrapolation. And that's generally to be avoided when you're doing interpolation, in that with interpolation, you need to estimate values between existing sample points. Once you're outside of the sampled space, which strictly here would be a beta hull of some kind that would just connect the outer dots or the outer points, like so. So strictly speaking, that would be our region in which we can do interpolation. Whereas out here, what ends up happening is extrapolation. And any extrapolation will have low or high uncertainty. Whereas within the interpolation area, you'll have more accuracy, let's say. Now, it's not true, because it's not completely true. It depends on where you are in the interpolation area. So where points are close together, you'll be interpolating more precise, more accurate values, whereas where locations are further apart, like in here, let's say, or in here, you'll be getting slightly lower accuracy and higher uncertainty towards the center of these gaps. So even interpolation itself is really an extrapolation, but we call it interpolation as long as it's within the boundary of all the sampled points, like so. So we'll look at this process in two ways: how we can get to a continuous surface, one that assumes a model of spatial autocorrelation. In general, the definition of interpolation is a process that takes values that are measured in space at sample locations, and these are usually points. So points that have something sampled at them could be snow depth, it could be temperature, it could be any continuous quantitative variable. And we use those known locations to predict samples and values for those samples, or I shouldn't say samples, but we predict values at unsampled locations. So unsampled locations here. So that means locations at which no measurements were taken. And we do that at small increments all over space in a particular study region so that we can get a continuous variable representation. And there's two groups or two ways in which we can do that type of interpolation. And one way is deterministic, and the second way is geostatistical or stochastic methods. And both methods, deterministic and geostatistical, they rely on the first law of geography, which is Tobler's law, which states that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. And in particular, we know that from our past lectures, that's spatial autocorrelation. Interpolation techniques can be deterministic or optimal geostatistical. Deterministic methods utilize an equation to produce an estimate of values where there are no values registered. And they can be global or local in nature. Geostatistical methods, and we'll see the most common deterministic method, which is inverse distance weighting, IDW, as an example. There's also trend surfaces and local splines, for example. So deterministic methods, and then we have geostatistical methods, which are based on random variables and chance, bringing into account things that have to do with random variables. We have a statistical means to estimate a surface and the uncertainties involved in the surface. For example, simple, universal, and ordinary kriging, or creaking. Now, these methods can be either exact or inexact. And all it means, exact versus inexact, is what happens when a location to be interpolated coincides with a location where you have a value measured. So let's say the circle here, measured value, and X is the location to interpolate. Well, in this case, in an exact method, when a location to be interpolated, the X here, maybe I'll make the X that color, like so. So when the X, which is a location to be interpolated, coincides with a measured value, in an exact interpolator, then the X will receive the exact value of the location that's been observed, which is coincident with it in space. So it's just a transfer of the measured value to the interpolation location directly, since they're both in the same location. Inexact methods don't do that, that's all. So inexact methods, the location to be interpolated can be different from the measured value there, because they take it into account, or they're created with some sort of statistical model. And that's the difference between exact and inexact interpolators. And some, depending on the options you choose when interpolating, some deterministic methods can be exact or inexact, and geostatistical methods can be exact or inexact.